In those wet markets, the animals that were in that market were illegally there. They should not have been there. 75% of all of the new infectious diseases that afflict man come from an animal reservoir. They jump species.
And now we're seeing in the natural world, without presumably the aid of a market, a crossover from bird flu into humans.
It's gotten into mammals like cows, and dairy workers are getting infected from cows who are infected. So we got to make sure we keep an eye on that.
It seems that more infections are transmitted today from animals and fowl than in the past. So is that one of those cases of we know more to recognize it, or is there in fact more of such infections?
Well, we're recognizing it more because of the travel, because of the animal-human interface has been increased over the last many years as we encroach upon the environment. An important fact that people should realize that at least 75% of all of the new infectious diseases that afflict man are zoonotic, Pat, which means they come from an animal reservoir, they jump species, and they affect men. There's so many examples of that. Influenza early on was primarily not a human infection. It was infection of wild birds and fowl, and then into chickens and pigs, and then into humans.
What's the difference in whether or not COVID came from a lab or from an animal source?
Well, I mean, in some respects, you want to know how an outbreak started so that you can get a lesson learned about how you can prevent that from happening in the future. A substantial proportion, in fact, an overwhelming proportion of evolutionary virologists feel strongly that the evidence that we have so far indicates that this was a naturally occurring outbreak from an animal host to a human. So the question you ask is, what difference does it make? Is that if it is a lab leak, we've got to make sure that we do things in the future that prevent that from happening again. And if it's from the wet market, which it looks like it is a natural occurrence, even though we don't know for sure, which is the reason why we keep an open mind, then we've got to be careful to make sure that we're very attentive to the animal-human interface because, in those wet markets, the animals that were in that market were illegally there. They should not have been there. And there's pretty good evidence that those wild animals that were sold for festive feast when people use it, as kind of a delicacy, that should never have been in the market. And there's pretty good evidence that they broke the rules that they essentially made themselves and they were there. So what one can do is, regardless of what the origin is, do what you can do to prevent such a thing happening again, either by regulating the markets much more stringently and or being very careful when you work in a laboratory with pathogens that could actually lead to a pandemic.
And now we're seeing in the natural world, without presumably the aid of a market, a crossover from bird flu into humans.
Right, exactly, which is what we're concerned about, keeping a real sharp eye on that. H5N1 bird flu has been around for quite a while. The first human cases that I had to deal with were back in 1997 in Hong Kong. What's happened now that's worrisome is that it's gotten into mammals like cows, and dairy workers are getting infected from cows who are infected. So you got to make sure you keep an eye on it and follow it very, very carefully.
One of the matters that has come to the fore is the question of I don't know if you would call them, they're not orphan diseases, but exotic diseases like Ebola, and how people seem to have an outsized fear of a disease, the likelihood of which they're getting is minimal, when, of course, the real risk to their health is the everyday, every year flu. What do you think there is that accounts for that?
I discussed that in some detail in my memoir, that there was more fear about Ebola spreading in the United States because we were bringing people who were volunteers, Americans who were volunteers, who were over in West Africa who accidentally got infected. We were taking care of them here. I personally, myself, took care of a couple of them in very strict containment facilities. And there was a concern that that's going to mean we're going to get an outbreak in the United States when people didn't fully appreciate that in order to spread Ebola, you have to have direct contact with the bodily fluids of a very sick person. So the chances of there being a major Ebola outbreak in the country are essentially zero. Not in West Africa, where the conditions of taking care of people, not anything near what you can have here in the United States. And yet the people were frightened, very much so, that we would have an Ebola outbreak in the United States, which no matter how many times we were telling them that's not going to happen, there was still a lot of fear of that.